Music theory with OneNote Hertz versus hue, multiple octaves, 3D shape. In other words, we will measure pitch in hertz, measure color or hue by wavelength, taking the two spectrums, bending them into a circle, mapping the color wheel on top of the pitch wheel, then popping them off the page, adding the 3D component, which for pitch is the octaves as we go up or down, the 3D component being natural in pitch. However, for music, there is no natural 3D component, therefore we're gonna add it by adding lightness, not brightness, lightness. So get ready and some coffee, because although we're just playing with one note, it's a beautiful note. You're not required to, but if you have access to it and would like to follow along, we're currently in the OneNote file of Modal Node System, MNS Presentation 2004, OneNote Hertz versus hue, multiple octaves, 3D shape, list of presentations, which we plan on adding plenty more to shortly. Also noting, in this OneNote presentation, we'll spend all of our time on the music theory side of things, but we have a similarly numbered and named presentation where we build these tables in Excel, practicing music, Excel, and just table visualization skills all at the same time. Our overall objective is to maximize the use of color to better understand music theory in general, better navigate the fretboard, more specifically, this being an example of our fretboard where we have the low or heavy E string, the one closest to the ceiling, on top. It's quite colorful. In practice, we can often tone down the color by, instead of putting a color on all 7 notes within the collection of notes we're working in, only putting a color on the specific note we're focused in on. This being the 7-note collection around the C major within each of the cells, which are only populated if they're one of the 7 notes within the collection. We have the letter, in this case a G, the note number 11 if we number them 1 through 12, and then we also have this 5 representing the Nashville number system, which is basically an absolute number system for the modes, which in this case is the Mixolydian mode, the Lydian mode, the Ionian mode, the Phrygian mode, and so on and so forth. By assigning a color to each of the notes, we can associate each of the 12 notes to a specific color as we are doing here. As we move up or change the key, for example, this is going from C major to D, we still have the same absolute colors. For example, you can see we still have the red for the A, the red for the A down here. So that's a great system in order to basically visualize all of the colors and be able to visualize the fretboard as a colored map, all notes having their own color. However, we might want a color system that allows us to move up, not tying the color to the notes, but tying the color to the mode. So if we were to do that, we have the same color system here, but it's now not tied to the C4, but to the Ionian mode. What happens when I move up to a 7-note collection around D major? Then the whole thing moves up. You can see this A was red. Now the red bit is over here. This whole shape has the same color format, color scheme as this shape here. So now we can see the shape moving up. So it's a very practical tool to use color. Most people, when they use color, they kind of just randomly assign the colors. The thing that we will map on here will be a better analogy of color, because the distance in color will be analogous to the distance in the pitch. That will also result in the maximum distance between hue colors on the color wheel as we equally space out the distance through all the colors on the color wheel. And it'll give us a color that we can permanently associate to a particular note and or a particular mode within each of the collection of notes, instead of just randomly assigning color. So all of those things, I think, can greatly increase our ability to use color efficiently. All right, so the way I want to do this is to kind of formally map this out. So we've talked about before the idea of mapping out the pitch wheel. We talked about mapping out the color wheel. And now we're going to get into the 3D component, meaning we want to go in more than one octave. And just note that oftentimes, if I was to color the fretboard, I might only color the fretboard in, one octave. I'm not going to have a different color set for a C4 versus like a C5 in terms of octave, the next octave up. But I might want a color set sometimes that does take into consideration those difference in the variations of octaves. That would mean that I would still have the same 7 colors, but now I'm going to add lightness. The other factor is going to be lightness. Now here's an example of that, noting that the colors are a little bit off here. I'll talk about kind of why that happened, but we have the C is basically red in this example. The point is, as we go up in pitch, we can see we have the same color. This is the same color in hue, but it has lightness. It's you could say it's brighter. I would typically say it's brighter, but there's a difference between brightness and lightness. We're using the lightness component. And then so you can see the color difference as we basically move up from a C4 to a C5. We can also see that there's repeat notes on a guitar, which we don't have on a piano. For example, this one has the same color tone as this one. So that's what we want to add here. We want to add that added dimension. Recap of what we've done thus far. We started by looking at that middle range octave area, which on a piano would be around the C4, but we actually want to be starting at the A, going from the A to the G sharp, basically in the middle of the piano, which if measured in hertz would be 440 hertz. Then when we double it, that's when we're going to get to the next octave up. That means we have an octave range measured in hertz, which is the oscillation of the waves or the compression waves going from 440 to 880. That was 441 different unit measures if I counted one more wave oscillation at a time. We couldn't have an equal distribution with that number because it won't bend into a circle because there's not 360 degrees. Therefore, we did a little bit of math in order, in essence, to bend it into a 360 degree analysis, giving us this information, which we can then use to basically map out the notes in our musical alphabet, which would be in that middle range, going from A to G sharp, and then this would be the number of hertz, and these would be the numbers on, in essence, the circle if we mapped them onto a circle, which is what we would like to do. Now, in pitch, when we go the octave up or an octave down, we have this phenomenon of our ear picking up that it's like an octave. You've gone the same thing, but it's going to be a higher pitch, but it's the same going from A to A. So that means I could start from 880 and double that to 1760 hertzes, which is a longer range, but you could think of like the ratios between them or how our ear perceives the distances will basically be, the same. So therefore, we want to do the same thing. I want to basically look at the next octave up and bend it into a circle, basically giving us 360 degrees with a little math we looked at last time. And this would be the octave up, which on a piano would be like to the right of the piano. When everything repeats to the right of the piano, we have A through G sharp, but now it's going to be an octave up starting at 880 hertz. Now, when we went to color, I'd like to map the color wheel on top of the pitch wheel, right? But the problem here is that we can only really do that on one octave. So obviously we'd like to map the color wheel on the area that we play most, which means it would be around that middle C, or more specifically from 440 to 880, from A to G, like in the middle of the piano. But then, which we'll do now, we also want to somehow add the phenomenon, the 3D component, which means we can't do it the same way. We have to use another factor. In other words, with color, we measure it by the wavelength, which I believe is nanometers of the wavelength. And so it goes up by wavelength, but that only takes into consideration, I believe, the hue or kind of the color tone. So we're not taking into consideration lightness or brightness, which are another factors you might play with when you're dealing with color. So when we're looking at the wavelength, I believe we're only looking at hue, color, not things like lightness or brightness. So we did the same thing. We basically bent this into a circle. So now we have a 360-degree circle that gives us the measurements of nanometers. And then we just said, hey, look, you know what I'm going to do is I'm just going to use the measurement that is given to us by the system that's already done this. I think it's an HLS system that bent the color wheel into a circle. So instead of measuring it by nanometers, I can just now measure it by 1 through 360 and use the HLS measuring system, which kind of fudged it because they basically took the bottom of that circle and bent it back around by adding magenta back to red, which is perfect for our analogy. So that's great. So now I can map the color wheel directly onto the pitch wheel for that middle area, middle C. And so that'll give us this. So these are going to be the colors that we get for those 12 notes. And I also have all 360 colors within that range that I could use if I want to do something like bending, or I want to do something like the average of two notes, which would be like an interval, right? So now that's great. And this, by the way, might be fine a lot of times when you're using this on like a fretboard, because I might just want to map out the fretboard and look for all of the notes that have the same color within it. And I'm not worried so much about different octaves, because I'm just trying to say where's an A, where's a C, or I might use it in terms of the Ionian, the modes from a Nashville number system. And I'm just looking, where's the Ionian? Where's the Aeolian? I'm not really caring if it's a C4 or a C5 from an octave perspective. But it would be nice if I'm practicing specifically to get a little bit more specific about the octaves, because then I can tell when I'm playing a particular chord, whether it's in a conventional format or whether it's inverted, and so on and so forth. I can start to focus in on which of the octaves I'm playing, right? And that's could be something I want to do. To do that, I need to add another dimension, and that's going to be the lightness. So there's lightness and there's brightness. Lightness is the one that we're using, which is actually closer to, it's how close is it to black, right? So now you're not measuring lightness or brightness by the length in nanometers of the color, but instead you're adding a factor of how close is it to black. You're going to make it more black or less black is going to be the idea. So this has the same hue, but now we're added the added dimension. So from our perspective, what I'm going to think about is, where am I in terms of the octaves? If I'm in the middle range, then I'm just going to use this color system, the one that pops the most. And then if I go to the left on the piano or down in pitch, I'm going to use this color system, which is darker, which I just asked ChatGPT to basically give us, right? And then if I go up in pitch, so if I'm onto the right, one octave up to the right, then I'm going to go higher in lightness. And I believe basically this one is fully saturated in lightness, which I believe is 0.5, if you want to like type it in there. And this one, then I believe I brought it down. I think you go down to make it darker. So I went 543.3, I think. And this one went up to 567. And then this one went down to one, I think, to go 2 octaves lower in pitch or left on the piano. And this would be 2 octaves up in pitch. So now we've got the middle point, and we've got 2 octaves lower and 2 octaves higher. Now I can't tie these colors specifically out to a particular number, right? Because the wavelengths don't have equivalent numbers going up or down. But I can say, hey, look, if I'm on if I'm on the A, that's going to be a higher pitch, 880A instead of a 440A, then I'm just going to choose this color set, which is going to be the higher pitched color set. All right, so that's going to be the general idea. Now that hopefully makes conceptual sense, but it gets a little confusing when we actually map it out here. So I want to actually map it out kind of linearly, but I'm going to do it up and down vertically. And the reason it gets a little confusing is in part because, once again, this is another area where the classical naming convention of octaves is a little wonky. Again, I don't think this is what you would do if you were to do the naming convention these days. In other words, you can see that we measured our pitch the normal way. We basically said, look, we're starting at 440 and we're going up to 880. That's going to be one octave, and we fit our 12 notes within that octave as it relates to like a circular. It would be evenly spaced if you made it into a circle. In essence, would be is basically what we did. So you would think then, if I named the octaves, that would be the middle point, would start at 440 and then go to 880. But what do we do on the piano? They call middle C starting at a C instead of an A, right? So that's kind of wonky, because on the piano we start naming the octave in the middle range at a middle C, which is, again, and we call that a 4. We call that a C4, which also is weird. So why is this weird? Well, number one, the main thing that's a problem is that you would think we would like to name the octaves for the range, the full set of notes, starting from the lowest, or the A, to the G sharp, which would be 440 to 880. So that's one thing that's kind of messy. The other thing that's a little weird is that why did we call the middle a 4? The only reason I can that I've talked to my best friend ChatGTP on this too, and the only thing we can come up with as of why they came up with a 4 is because they didn't want to go to negative numbers, right? So it's kind of weird that it would be a 4. What would be better? To me, it would make sense to say, if I'm on the middle range, I would call that the octave 0. That would be the middle octave, 0 octave, right? And then if I go an octave up, I would call that a 1 octave up. So this, the numbering system that would make the most sense to me would be here. I'm saying I'm on a 0 octave right here, and then you would have a symmetrical system. When I go to the right hand, to the octave up, it would be going 1 octave up and then 2 octaves up. When I go to the left hand, it would be -1 and -2, right, from an octave perspective. But that's not what we have on the piano, so I'm going to show you both of those systems. This would, what I think would be the most elegant, symmetrical system. Now, there's other like softwares out there that are trying to make it simple for math, right? Like the other way you could do it is you could start counting your system basically at 0 hertz, right, or something, and then count up from there. Like a MIDI system, the MIDI I think it's called, does things like that with the note system. But that might work for a computer, and it makes sense because then you don't have to deal with negative numbers and whatnot. But it doesn't really make sense from a human standpoint, because obviously we want, like, if I'm going to give an absolute numbering system for the notes, I don't want the notes to start out way back when I can't even hear the octave, when I can't even hear the pitches at like 0 hertz. I'm not going to count up from 0 hertz, because then when I get to the range that is actually middle range that I play in, I'm going to have numbers that are like 55 or something like that, right? What I want to have, if I'm going to have an absolute numbering system, is the 12 notes that I play in the middle range should be numbered 1 through 12, or 0 through 11 might even be better. But the middle point should be there, and that means when I go back in negative numbers, I'm going to end up in negative territory, and that's okay, because again, the focal point is in the middle. And when I number the octaves, I don't want to bring the octaves, start numbering from 0 way back when the octaves are way back when, right? You could do that, but it would make more sense to me to say that the octave that we normally play in is the 0 octave. It's the middle octave on the number line, and then we go 1 octave up or 2 octaves up or 2 octaves back, right? So that's what gets a little bit wonky. So let me show you what I mean. This middle area, the orange area, is going to be representing the middle part of the piano that I'm going to think of as starting on A, even though the piano starts the middle range, C4 starts at a C, right? I'm going to number that 1 through 12. This is going to be the local numbering system, which will repeat because all letters will have one number, 1 through 12. But this will be the system that's an absolute numbering system, meaning when I go up to the next octave, I could have a system where it goes up to 13. That gives me a different number, which I know is an octave up because 13 minus 12 is 1, which would be a 1 or an A. So that allows me to see a numbering system that's an absolute numbering system that's going to keep on going up as the octaves go up. But I know that there's still a local numbering system, which will always be a repeat of 1 through 12, just an octave up. So this note right here, I could say the A, which is an octave up from the middle range, which would be a C3 from the piano, but I would call it like a C middle, the middle C, a C0 from an octave perspective. I know it's an octave up because I say it's a 13, because it's going to be 13 minus 12 is 1, which is an A. Or I can say it's, from a number standpoint, it's a 1, but it's an octave up from the middle range, right? From the middle part of the piano. Okay, so, but again, that middle terminology gets messy because the piano calls a C4 starting on a C instead of the A, which is, again, strange. So then the piano is going to start on, or normally they start, when we say the octave, we're going to call it a C4. Now, if I start on C and I say it's a C4, then it's going to go up all the way down to here. It's not going to, it's going to say C4 is going to go down to this range, down to here to do it. So it's going to go down to a B. B4 is now down here. So this stagger, this little stagger thing is a mess. It shouldn't really be that way. That's causing like problems, but that's what we have to deal with, right? So now this is giving me the letter. This is going to be the distance. I'm going to give the absolute distance here, and then the letter, and then this is the 3, which represents, on our normal convention, it would be an A3, because that would be the octave. That 3 is now the octave. I would rather call it a 1 note away A, and then it's going to be the 0th octave. That's what I think would be the best thing if I could rename it from scratch, right? If you were to naturally name it, I would name A through the middle, A through G sharp, as the 0th octave. It would be the middle octave, right? But so we can compare those two. I'm just going to compare them. It'll be difficult unless you're working with someone to switch to this convention, right? But that's the convention that makes most sense. So I would just want to put that in mind. Now, when I have my colors then, this middle range, we have an issue. Like, okay, now I have this middle range here of colors. What am I going to do? If you would think that I want to start it on the C4 so that the middle color range will be all on the 4s, right? The 4 octave convention. But that doesn't quite work because when we mapped on the colors to the color wheel, we saw that if we're trying to tie it out mathematically, the 440 hertz should be tying out to the red, or the smallest wavelength, which starts at red. Now, you could twist it, like you could make the argument and say, well, yeah, it doesn't really matter because it's an analogy, so I will pull it down here. And that's what I did with our fretboard. That's why the colored fretboard had a red one for the C instead of the green for the C. However, the more I thought about it, I think it's actually better to keep it up here where it should be, right? In other words, I let the convention convince me that I should move it down here, even though it's a total mess to do that. And my goal is to try to clean things up as much as possible. So I don't think we can kind of get rid of the terminology of a C4 because it's kind of ingrained and everything. So you're gonna have to deal with that. But I think it's useful to say, hey, look, that doesn't make any sense really, because what we should be doing is saying the middle octave, we named it A through G. We call the Hertz 440 to 880. That's what most people typically think of. Most people don't know like the Hertz for any other place other than 440 to 880, if they know any of them at all. Meaning they don't know the Hertz for the C4, right? Oftentimes they know the Hertz for the 440, the A, because it makes sense to count it from A to A. So that means that I'm gonna list what I would prefer the naming convention to be, and I'm gonna list out the colors here to line up with what I think it should be, which is 440 to 880 as that middle color range. Which means when we map it out on the fretboard, we have to deal with the fact that when I use the normal naming convention, these first three colors are going to be an A3, an A3, an A sharp flea, and a B3. And these down to here are going to be the 4s. And then you've got these 3 notes that are going to be up in the other color scheme up higher. So I think that's the best way to do it. And we just have to deal with that when you look on the fretboard and say, oh, okay, when I'm looking at the C4s go from, this numbering system goes from C to C or C to B, right? When it should be going from A to G. It doesn't make sense really, except from the standpoint of preferring the key of C, why you would number it that way, right? It's another kind of thing that gets wonky on the numbering. All right, so given that, then once I go down 12, after 12, we repeat again for the local distance. I make that blue. Just this blue doesn't mean anything other than I want to keep it separate from the last section. But if I use an absolute numbering system, I go to 13. So that means if I number the notes themselves can tell me what octave I'm in, which is quite useful and convenient. And it's just crazy that we don't use some kind of numbering system with the notes, because clearly we can use some math with the notes, simple math, just adding and subtracting and whatnot, in order to say, well, if you say it's an absolute note number 15, then I would say, okay, well, yeah, that means that it's got to be a B, because 15 minus 12 is 5 minus 2, which is 3, which is a B. So this simple math works quite well. And again, the math should be so that either this is a 0 or a 1. I chose a 1 here to start on the A as a 1 going up through 12, because that should be the middle range. In other words, you shouldn't be having the math start at 0 way back with an octave at 0, where the hertz are at 0, counting up from 0 hertz. That doesn't make any sense. It makes sense from a computer, but we want the middle part of the number system for our minds to be either 0 through 12 or 1 through 12, as I have here. So we can do simple math, and I can just say it's absolute note number 15, which I know would be an octave up, because 15 minus 12 is like 5 minus 2, which would be a 3, which from the local distance would be a 3, would be a B. And so notice if I use the piano naming, which goes from C4 to B4, then we would start at C5 here. I would like to say the middle part would be 0. That would be the middle range on the number line starts at 0. And then we go up higher in pitch to the right of the piano would be a 1. That would be a better way to do it. But we deal with what we have. So they're driving us crazy with this thing. So that's going to be our numbers going up. So the old convention, I'm still going to give an absolute number now of 15, which would be a 3 for the local. It's a B, and they would call that a B4. This is going to be a 16, which would be a 4 for the local, which is a C. I'm going to call it a 16C5 now. Okay, and then if I use my preferred naming convention, I would like to say this is now an octave up. It started at the 0 octave, the middle. Now we're at a 1, which is an A, and it's a octave up, 1 octave up. This would be a 2, A sharp, it's still 1 octave up. A 3B, it's 1 octave up to the right. And then the color is going to be a lighter color. So now I can see this red right here is this red right here. This is this here. These are the same hue colors, but now the brightness has been adjusted. And then if I go 2 octaves up, which for a guitar, notice that, by the way, on a piano, we think of middle C like in the middle. So you kind of almost have an equal distance to the right and to the left. But on a guitar, then the top string is mainly like this middle component. So that means we have less distance on the low end, and we're really usually going up on the high end. So when we say the middle point on the guitar, that's what we typically play in. And then we're usually going up from there. We have basically, 2 to 3, around a little over 2 octaves going up. And then we have a little bit going back, right? But we don't have as much space going in the negative direction. So we have less range on the guitar than on the piano. Okay, so then if I go up the next one, the local distance from the notes would be 1 through 12. If I just keep counting up, then we'd be on 25. 25 minus 12 minus 12 would be a local distance of 1, which would be an A. If I take 2 octaves up, it's greater than 24, 12 plus 12. So I could just say 25 minus 24 would be 1, which is an A. And so it would be an A5 for the normal naming convention, but I'd like to say it would be an A2, a 25 A2, or a 25 A2 instead of an A5, because it's the middle range would be 0 and then 1, 2. And then if we go down to this one, this is going to be the C. That's when it's going to convert to a 6. So this would be a C6. This one's a C6 up there. So that's a 28 C6. I'd like to be calling it still this is a local, I have a local distance, 4-note C4, because I use the local distance here. And so that would be going this way. And then the colors will be an octave up. Now these colors get a little bit hard to see when you see them like in a range like this, but remember, on a fretboard, you'd only be looking at typically a collection of 7 notes at a time that would be spaced, generally having at least whole note spacings between them. And then we might even trim it down to less than that as we're focusing in on whatever it is that we're basically looking at. Now we could go up the other way, which would be left on the piano. On the guitar, again, we have less range because that top string is typically in the middle range, going from the middle A to G, right? So if I go up, then the local distance in numbers, I'm going to call it blue again, just to differentiate between this side. So I'm going up directionally, kind of towards the ceiling on a guitar, but down pitch-wise. If I use an absolute numbering system, this is where it gets a little wonky, because I started on a 1, which makes sense because the middle area is a 1. You could argue that it should be 0. I won't get into that because we could have made it 0, but we made that argument before. We started on a 1. That means if I go back, I have to call it a 0. So that's a little bit counterintuitive. Most people, it takes a little bit of time to kind of think, okay, if I go in the negative direction, I'm going to get negative numbers, but that makes sense from an absolute basic numbering system. So it would be -1, -2, -3, -4, and we could basically use our math to say, well, if I take -3, plus 12, that'll give me a local distance of 9. So it gets a little bit messy to do the math going in the negative, but we could do it, and that would be, from a normal naming, a C3 or a 3 octave. And I would like to call it a -1. So if this is the middle range, it would be better to say the middle is 0. And if I go back, it would be -1. So now we have, this would be like a -4 absolute numbering system, which would be an E. And then the 3 would be the normal range. if we say the middle is 4, this would be back to a 3. And then, but I'd like to call it an 8, which is an E. This is now the local distance, an 8, which is an E, and it would be a -1 for the octave, because it's 1 octave down. So then if I keep on going up to the next one up, this one started at a 3 for a B under the normal convention. So when I get back to a C, that's when we would be up here, or a B. So now it goes to a 2 up here, right? So this would be a -9 for the absolute numbering system, and it would be a B2 as we go down or lower in an octave. I'd like to call it a 3 or a -9. This is the local distance, B, and then it would be a -1 still, right? Because we shouldn't be getting to the next octave down if we were doing it correctly until we get to here. So now we'd have a 12 G sharp -2. So now we're -2 octaves if we were going like from A to A, right? And so this would be the 2 octaves back, which again, we don't see too often or working really on the guitar so much, but we can, in theory, go back multiple octaves. And these are going to be the lower or darker color pitched. So that's going to be the layout that we will have that we could then map out onto the fretboard. So when we map it out onto the fretboard, we're going to say this is the middle range. I could map out the fretboard to just have these colors for all A's are this red. I don't care what the octave is, right? All C's are going to be this green. I don't care what the octave is. That's great. But if I want to take into consideration the octaves, then this would be the middle range, which would be kind of like the top of let's take a look at it, the fretboard. So you can see the top of the fretboard is the C4 and then a B3. This is the conventional naming convention, a 3, a 3, a 3, and a 3. So we haven't really gotten back to the 2s, right? So we're really going from what would be like basically the middle range, what you normally play on the piano, and then going up, right? As we go this way to the right, as we go down towards the floor, we're going higher in pitch because this is the lower heavy E string, the one closest to the ceiling. As we go down directionally to the floor on the piano, we're going higher in pitch. And as we go towards the right or to the body, to the sound hole of the guitar, we also are going higher in pitch. So we're basically kind of like in the middle of the piano in essence, and then we're going mainly to the right. We don't have the same range on the piano to be going left towards the heavier or heavier sounds. So that's going to be the general idea. But of course, on the guitar, we have layered strings. So that means we're going to have octaves that repeat. So it's great on the guitar to learn the pattern. Where are all the notes? Where are all the C's? Or where are all the Ionians? And so on and so forth. And then add the octaves. Know which of the notes are actually the same note. Which of the notes are going to be 1 octave up, 2 octaves up, 3 octaves up. Know the octave range, which the color patterns could help us to do. This one being based on, like I said, the red is the C. So that was, I kind of was moving the color pattern up because the C would typically be green in our color pattern that we've settled on. But you get the idea that it's going to go higher in the color here, and that's going to give us that range that we can use as a tool to practice with.